Well, it's been a productive couple of weeks working on the Haven. As you can see, I've got the wooden keel all formed and fitted and bolted to the floor timbers. In this episode, I'm going to show you how I did that. So stick around. This is the art of boat building. My name is Bob Emser. I'm a sculptor and a boat builder. My sculptures have always been inspired by nautical and aeronautical imagery. In fact, sometimes people passing by my studio would ask if I'm building a boat. I've always enjoyed the artistry of wooden boats. It seems like I've been building boats for over 40 years, and now I'm building sculptures that float. Welcome to the art of boat building. If you remember where we left off, we had just fit the pattern for the wooden keel on the boat, and I was doing a little fairing of the floor timbers and frames to make sure that the keel fared out nicely. So we're ready to start building the wooden keel. Before we do that, let's take a look at what the plans call for. Now, over here at the drawings, you can see that this is a drawing of the pattern that we just saw that was on the boat. You may remember seeing me make this pattern in episode 2. On the pattern, it shows where the centerboard will be, which is very critical for that is really the thing that we have to work off of. And then there are a couple of measurements. This outer line here is the bearding line, or I should say the rabbet line. And the rabbet line is where the planks will meet the keel. The other inner line here is where the ballast keel and the deadwood will meet the wooden keel. So it's in a little bit. Therefore, that piece of the keel at that point will then be shaped probably in a slight radius to fit down onto the planking. And those details are sort of shown here. So remember, this is showing the bottom of the boat. The way we will put it on there is upside down because we have the boat upside down. So let's look at the construction drawing. On the construction drawing, we can see that detail even a little bit better, where this is the wooden keel right here. This would be the ballast keel, and this would be a floor timber. So you can see how there's just a slight little radius there that meets the planking. The important thing on this plan that it tells us what size this piece of wood needs to be. So it needs to be 1 3/8 of an inch thick by a maximum of 8 inches wide, which is what we could see on that plan where it starts to taper from the stem down to the stern, and it gets wide right where it is near the centerboard trunk. So there are a couple of ways that we can accomplish making this wooden keel. One way would be to get a 1 3/8 inch piece of white oak that's 8 inches wide and at least a little bit more than 12 feet long, probably about 12'3". It was very hard for me to source a piece of white oak of that dimension that had not been killed dry. What I did find, however, were 2 boards that were 7/8 of an inch thick, and they were exactly 12 feet long. So what my plan is, instead of taking a very thick piece of wood and steam bending it to the shape, I'm going to take those 2 7/8 inch rough sawn boards and resaw them down so that they are basically 1/4 of the 1 3/8, which works out to be about 11 30-seconds. Well, not about, it is 11 30-seconds. So, first task was to cut these boards down so that they are 8 inches wide, and then to begin resawing. My son-in-law Chad gave me a hand with these long boards while resawing. After resawing, I thickness planed the 4 slices to the 11/32 of an inch. All stacked together, measured 1 3/8. 3 of the boards were about 3 inches shy of the length needed. I prepared an 8-to-1 scarf joint so that I could add some length. I then glued the scarf joints together, inserting a plastic sheet between the layers as to avoid them adhering to each other. I placed some weights on the joints so that they would stay put while curing. These boards have been curing now for a couple of days, and looks like they all glued up pretty well. Maybe a little bit of cleanup will need to be done on them, but they look pretty good. So the next thing to do is to lay these out and cut the slot for the center board, and also to cut the outside shape. And one of the things I want to be careful to do is I'll stagger these boards back and forth so that none of these scarf joints are actually right on top of each other, that there's at least a board that goes underneath there to make those joints a little stronger. After cutting the center board slot, I checked it for alignment. After a bit of tune-up, it fit nicely. Once we got it fit well over the center board trunk, you're now going to take the first laminate here and bring it down, and then I'm going to trim it off here at the stem. So the way I'm going to do that is put a clamp on here and then use my pole saw to cut it. With the first one fit, now I'll just do the same for the next laminate. Well, now that we have that trimmed up, we can take these molds off, and we'll put some tape on top of the floor timbers and the center board trunk so that when we epoxy these together, we don't glue them to the boat yet. Okay, that should do it for the tape to protect the molds. Next thing to do is to unclamp the Keel laminates, and start with the bottom one and put it on here, and then mix up some epoxy and start laying the layers up there and get them clamped down. Well, it looks pretty good. Well, you know the saying about clamps, you never have too many. Today is a day to prove that. So everything seemed to have gone pretty smoothly. I'll let this cure for a good 24 hours, maybe 48, and then we'll pull it off there and get started shaping the rabbit. Well, now that we have the keel reassembled and all cleaned up and trued up, it's now time to establish where the center of each floor timber falls across the keel. In several cases, there are 2 keel bolts that go in as it gets wider, and as it gets closer to the stem, there's usually just 1 bolt in there. So once we get those center lines established, then we will countersink them with a 3/4 inch Forstner bit so that the 5/16 carriage bolts that the head will fit down inside of there. So the next step is to get that laid out and get those holes drilled. Once the countersink holes were drilled, I then clamped a straight board to the frames as a reference for drilling the 5/16 inch holes through the keel and the floor timbers. Now that I've got all of the holes drilled through the floor timbers, we need to go through now and mark the rabbet line, and also we need to mark where we need to trim off the bed logs. So I have this small piece of 1/2 inch plywood, which represents the thickness of the plank, and I cut it on a little bevel. So when I place this then on the top of the frame, I can then go up here and I can make a little tick mark on where that the plank will lay on the bed log. And so I'll go along and do this on each of the stations. So the other thing that I need to do is then to mark the top of it here. And I'll simply do that by scribing a line along the keel where it will be, like so. So I'll continue to mark the bed log on the both sides, and then we'll be ready to mark the rabbet on the areas not at the centerboard trunk. Well, now that we've got the bed logs marked off where we need to trim it, we now need to establish where the rabbet line will meet the keel. So we'll use the same little piece of marking gauge, and we'll push this up tight and then mark it like so. So the next thing we need to do is to establish what the angle of that rabbet needs to be. So our next step is to determine what the angle of this rabbet needs to be. Now you know that our garboard will go in there, and this face of the garboard will be at 90 degrees. So what we'll do is I'll take a wedge like so, which is what I'll actually attach to the frame in order to ferret it out properly. With that then I can take my bevel gauge and I can mark what that angle that the garboard will be meeting it at. And then what I'll do is simply take up here on top of the keel and make a mark, and that will be this station's mark. Now, this won't be necessary every frame, but what I'll probably do is mark it at each station mark. So I'll go through and mark that, and then that will help us establish what angle we need to cut that rabbet at. Using the reference angle, I rasped that angle at each station. I then carved the rabbet between the stations using my spoke shave. After I carved the rolling bevel of the rabbet, I then used my power plane to remove the excess material between the rabbet line and the ballast keel location. The keel is all finished and ready to go on the boat. Earlier I had coated the exposed areas with some TotalBoat Underdog, which is an anti-fouling agent. This inside here could see some bilge water, so I wanted to make sure that I had was able to put a good coat of a primer on there, and that seemed to work really well. So now that we have the keel ready, we can put some bedding compound down on the bed log and get this baby installed. I used 3M's 5200 marine adhesive sealant. After squeezing out the sealant, I used a 3/16" notch trowel to get good coverage. I'm using 5/16" bronze carriage bolts to bolt this down to the floor timbers. Use a drift pin to set that carriage bolt. And you take a bronze washer and a bronze nut. Put that on and tighten it up. The last step to attaching the wooden keel is called for in the plans, and that is a 2-inch bronze screw on the stern end of the keel. I'll leave the clamps on until the bedding compound can fully cure. Well, I was just testing to see how this piece of 1/2-inch cedar would lay on the frames and fit into that rabbet, and I'm pretty happy with the way that it's turned out. So the next step is to start planking, and we get to start cutting into this stock of Atlantic white cedar. So I'm pretty excited about that. So in the next episode, we will start spiling the garboard plank for both sides of the boat. I want to take a moment and thank all of the new subscribers, and also want to invite you to become a Patreon to the channel. It really makes a big difference in helping to produce these videos. So, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.